The first thing Mara noticed about him was his hands. Not his face, though his face was worth noticing, angular and severe, the kind of face that had grown up being stared at and had learned to stare back harder. Not the clothes, which were wrong for the diner in every possible way. Black silk under a gray coat cut close at the shoulders, a faint iridescent sheen to the fabric that caught the fluorescent light and gave it back richer than it deserved. Not the way the other customers moved around him without looking, their bodies instinctively curving away the way water parts around a stone. His hands. They were resting flat on the laminate countertop, very still, and they were doing something she hadn't seen in years. The right thumb pressing against the left palm. A tap release. Then the index finger curling, then 3 fingers spread. She set the coffee pot down. It wasn't ASL, not exactly. The shapes were wrong in small ways, the rhythm too deliberate, the spacing too careful, like someone who had learned the grammar from a book rather than from a mother's patient hands. But the root was there. The architecture was there. She watched him do it again. Thumb, release, index, 3 spread fingers. Her little brother Danny had done something similar when he was trying to tell her he was scared. He'd been 7. She'd been 9. They'd been hiding under the stairs during a thunderstorm, and he couldn't find the right sign fast enough, so he'd invented one. Pressed his thumb to her palm 3 times like a heartbeat. 3, I'm here, don't go. She picked up the coffee pot and walked to the end of the counter. You want coffee? She said. The young man looked up. His eyes were a color she didn't have a name for, not gray, not silver, not the pale blue of winter sky. Something between all of them, something that made her think of deep water. He watched her mouth carefully. He did not speak. She pointed to the pot, raised an eyebrow. He nodded. She poured. He watched the coffee fill the mug like it was the most interesting thing in the room, and she had the sense it wasn't the coffee he was watching. It was the act of being offered something without condition, which was possibly new to him. The diner was called Ruthie's. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had been 3 other things before it, a hardware store, a laundromat, a bail bondsman, and it smelled permanently of all of them underneath the bacon grease and coffee. 8 stools at the counter, 12 tables, a chalkboard menu on the back wall that Mara updated every morning in her increasingly illegible handwriting. The breakfast rush had thinned. 2 truckers at the corner table, a retired schoolteacher named Dot who came every Tuesday to do her crossword, a man in paint-stained overalls who'd been nursing the same cup of tea for 40 minutes. None of them paid any attention to the young man at the end of the counter. That Mara had noticed too. It wasn't normal not noticing. It was aggressive not noticing, the kind practiced by people who have been told, explicitly or by long cultural habit, that not seeing someone is a form of respect. The truckers had looked at him when he walked in and then looked away with a speed that suggested some silent communication had passed between them. The schoolteacher hadn't looked at all. The man in the paint-stained overalls had gone very still for a moment and then become deeply interested in his tea. Mara had grown up in this neighborhood. She knew when people were afraid. She leaned on the counter. You hungry? She said, and because she wasn't sure what he could hear, she made the sign as she said it, the curved hand moving toward the sternum, the universal hunger gesture that existed in some form in nearly every sign language she'd ever seen, because the body always finds the same metaphors for the same needs. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes and then a careful loosening, like a door being tested to see if it was locked. He raised one hand, slowly, deliberately. He signed back. Not fluent, she could see the hesitation, the searching but real, a proper handshape she recognized, the flat hand sweeping forward from the chin. Thank you. She felt the back of her neck prickle. You're welcome, she said and signed it. He ordered in the end by pointing at the menu and holding up fingers for quantities. 2 eggs, toast, the small orange juice. She put the order in and refilled his coffee without asking, and when she came back from the kitchen pass-through, she found him watching the door with an expression that was not quite worry and not quite calculation, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "You waiting for someone?" she said. He looked at her. Then he signed something long and complicated that she caught maybe 60% of. She was rusty, hadn't used it properly in 11 years, not since Danny, but she got enough. She got people coming, not good. She set down the coffee pot. "How many people?" He held up both hands. 10, then added a finger. 11. "Coming here." He shook his head, then pointed down, which she interpreted as coming to this area, this block, this building. Then he signed something she didn't know, a compound shape that he repeated twice, watching her face to see if it landed. It didn't. He tried again, slower, and she realized he was trying to fingerspell something, not in English letters but in something else entirely, a system she'd never seen, elegant and precise, with a logic she couldn't map. "I don't know that one," she said. "I'm sorry." He looked at the counter for a moment. Then he picked up the pen she kept clipped to her apron and held his hand out. She gave it to him. He wrote 3 words on a napkin and slid it across to her. "They want me." Mara looked at the napkin. She looked at him. She looked at the door, where nothing was happening yet, where the morning street was still doing its ordinary morning things. A woman walking a dog, a delivery van double parked, a kid on a bicycle weaving between parking meters with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been hit by a car yet and cannot imagine it. She thought about all the times she'd read about situations like this in news articles. She then put down and picked up again 3 times before she could finish them, because the world was full of people being hunted for being who they were, and she never knew what to do with that information except carry it. "Okay," she said, "eat your eggs first." He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look surprised. She slid his plate in front of him. "You can't make good decisions on an empty stomach. Ask anyone." He looked at her for a long moment with those 2 deep eyes. Then he picked up his fork. She watched the door. Her name was Mara Vasquez, and she was 28 years old, and she had been working at Ruthie's for 6 years, because she'd started the job to pay for a culinary program at the community college, and then her mother got sick, and the culinary program had become a someday thing, which was how someday things happened, not with a bang, but with a series of small, completely reasonable decisions that added up to the rest of your life. She was not unhappy. She liked the work, liked the regulars, liked the rhythm of the early shift when the city was still figuring out what kind of day it was going to be. She had a studio apartment 4 blocks away, and a cat named Grid, and a copy of Julia Child on the shelf that she was going to read cover to cover as soon as things calmed down. She had a little brother who had been deaf since birth, and who had died at 23 in a car accident on a Tuesday in November, and she had never fully worked out how to be a person who knew that. She had learned sign language at age 4, because Danny needed her to. She was, in other words, not who anyone would send to intercept a prince. The bell above the door rang at 9:47 a.m. The first one through was a woman in a charcoal suit who scanned the room with the focused efficiency of someone doing a job. Behind her, 2 men, also suited, also scanning. Then 2 more. The 5 of them spread out without speaking, moving to cover the exits and the sightlines, and the truckers in the corner stood up and left their breakfast and walked out with the particular speed of men who have decided not to be involved in whatever this is, and the school teacher packed up her crossword, and the man in the paint-stained overalls was already gone. Mara realized she hadn't seen him leave. The woman in the charcoal suit walked to the counter. She had a face that had been trained into neutrality over a long time. "The young man at the end of the counter," she said, "you need to step away." Mara did not step away. "He's eating his breakfast." "Step away from the counter." "Do you want coffee?" Mara said. The woman looked at her with the patient exasperation of someone who has dealt with civilians before and knows exactly how this ends. You don't understand the situation. I understand he's a paying customer, Mara said. I understand you've got 4 people blocking my exits, which is a fire code violation. I understand your colleague by the back door is making my dishwasher extremely nervous. The young man at the end of the counter had stopped eating. He was very still, the way prey animals go still when they've run out of options, and Mara could see the resignation in it, the long practice of it, the way a person holds their body when they have learned that stillness is the only form of control they have left. She hated that. She'd seen it on Danny's face too, in doctors' offices and school meetings and 100 situations where someone spoke around him and through him, and past him because they'd already decided he was the kind of person things happened to rather than the kind of person who happened to things. She'd hated it then. She hated it now with the same clean, bright rage she'd felt at 9 years old, and she'd had 20 years to get better at doing something with it. "What's his name?" she said. The woman in the charcoal suit blinked. "What?" "His name, do you know it?" "Ma'am." "Because I know his name," Mara said, which was a lie, but she was committed now. "And I know he asked me for help. And I know you've got 5 people in here and he's one person who hasn't done anything except eat eggs and toast. And I'd really like someone to explain to me what he's done that requires this kind of response." The woman in the charcoal suit looked at her with something that had shifted from patient exasperation to careful reassessment. "You don't know who he is." "I know he can hear you just fine," Mara said. "I know he's right here. I know he understands everything being said about him. Maybe talk to him instead of about him." A silence. The young man at the end of the counter turned on his stool and looked at the woman in the charcoal suit for the first time. His expression was still careful, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, a tiny, precarious thing, like a candle in a high wind, which was the look of a person who has just been publicly defended for the first time in a while and doesn't yet know what to do with that. The woman in the charcoal suit said in a completely different tone, "Your Highness, your father." He signed something sharp and short. Myra caught it. "No. Your Highness. The situation." He signed again, more elaborate this time, and she watched his hands and caught pieces. Not enough. Not enough. But she caught the shape for stay and the shape for here and what might have been the shape for choose. A hand shape she'd taught herself from a video at 3 in the morning once when she couldn't sleep and had gone down a rabbit hole about dialects. The woman in the charcoal suit looked at Mara. "Can you understand him?" "Some of it." "What did he say?" Mara looked at the young man. He was looking at her and she realized she was the translator now, the bridge, the person standing in the gap, and she also realized that he had known from the moment she'd signed back to him that she might be. That was why he was still here. Not because he hadn't heard them coming. He had. He told her they were coming 11 minutes before they arrived. He had stayed because she was here. He said he's staying. The woman in the charcoal suit closed her eyes briefly. "You don't understand. His father, the king, has sent us to bring him home for his protection." "His protection," Mara said. "Right. The situation in the capital." "What situation?" A pause. The woman in the charcoal suit made a small gesture, and one of her colleagues by the door relaxed marginally. Whatever the internal calculation was, she decided to give information rather than take action. There are parties within the court who believe the prince is a liability. The king's succession is contested. The prince is mute and she stopped, chose her next words carefully. There are those who believe that a king who cannot speak cannot rule. Mara looked at the young man. He was watching her face. She signed what she'd understood. People in palace think you cannot rule because you cannot talk. His jaw tightened. Then he signed back, slowly and clearly, making sure she could follow. "I can talk," he signed. they just never learn to listen. She repeated it out loud. He says he can talk, they just never learn to listen. The diner was very quiet. Mara said, "So what happens if you take him back now?" The woman in the charcoal suit said, "He will be protected." "That's not what I asked." A longer pause. "The court will proceed with succession planning." "Will he be safe?" The woman looked at her. The look said many things. It said, "This is above your pay grade and this is not your problem and you should step back from this now while you still can." It also said, in the small tightening of something behind her eyes, that she knew the answer and did not like it. "The king's preference is." "Will he be safe?" Mara said again. The woman in the charcoal suit did not answer. Mara looked at the young man. She signed, "Do you want to go with them?" He looked at the 5 people positioned around the diner. He looked at the door. He looked at the napkin on the counter that still said, "They want me." Then he looked at her. He signed no. She turned back to the woman in the charcoal suit. "He doesn't want to go. He is the crown prince of." "He's a person," Mara said. "He's a person sitting in my diner, and he's told me he doesn't want to go with you. And I'm going to need something more than he's a prince before I help you take him somewhere he doesn't want to be." The woman in the charcoal suit studied her for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "You're making a mistake." "Probably," Mara agreed. "I make about 4 a day on average. You want coffee?" They left. Not all at once. There was a murmured conversation between the woman and one of the men by the door. A phone call made outside the window. A long look exchanged between 2 of them that meant something Mara couldn't read. But they filed out, the bell above the door ringing 5 times, and then it was just her and him and Dot, the schoolteacher, who had apparently decided that none of this was interesting enough to interrupt her crossword, and the distant sounds of the kitchen where Carlos the dishwasher was pointedly running water very loudly. Mara sat down on the stool next to the young man. She said, "Okay, start from the beginning." It took 40 minutes and 2 napkins, because his written English was formal and slightly archaic, in a way that suggested he'd learned it from books rather than conversation. She filled in the gaps with signs she remembered, and signs she improvised, and a lot of pointing at things, and he filled in her gaps with careful repetition, and once, a small smile when she got something right that she hadn't expected to get. His name was Kalen. He was 22. He was the only child of the Dragon King, a title she did not fully understand yet, because the word dragon translated to something in his language that she couldn't map to the English word, something about fire and depth and old power that was more concept than creature. His father had ruled for 30 years. There were factions. There had always been factions. And the factions had recently coalesced around a single point of agreement, that the crown prince, being mute since birth, was unsuitable. She asked, unsuitable for what? He wrote everything: court, ceremony, treaty, alliance. A king must speak to ambassadors, must give speeches, must read proclamations, must shout orders in battle. I can do none of these things. She said carefully, "Can you write them down?" He looked at her. She said, "The speeches, the orders, the proclamations, can you write them?" He wrote, "Yes, but..." She said, "Can someone speak them for you, while you..." She made the sign she'd invented on the spot, hands moving together, one voice, one sign, a kind of tandem motion. He stared at her hands. She said, "My brother couldn't hear. When he was in meetings, I was sometimes there to sign what people were saying. I was his..." She paused, finding the word. His voice. For the words that came to him in another language. She shook her head. I'm not saying you need me specifically. I'm saying the problem you're describing sounds like it has a practical solution that nobody's tried." He was very still. She said, "Or am I wrong? Is there something that actually requires you to physically say the words yourself?" He was quiet for a long time, not the practiced quiet of someone avoiding a question. The genuine quiet of someone who has been told a thing so many times for so long that they have stopped testing whether it's true. He wrote finally, "No one ever suggested it." She said, "Then they weren't paying attention." He looked at her with those impossible eyes, and the candle she'd seen earlier, the small precarious thing, was still there. But it was steadier now, not in a high wind anymore, more like a candle in a room where someone had finally closed the window. He wrote, "Why are you helping me?" She thought about Danny. She thought about the doctor's offices and the school meetings and the particular exhaustion of watching someone capable and intelligent be reduced to their incapacity by people who decided incapacity was all they were. She thought about the thunderstorm and the stairs and 3 taps on her palm meaning "I'm here, don't go." She said, "Because you signed thank you and nobody does that by accident. You had to learn it. You wanted to talk to people badly enough to teach yourself how. That's not a liability." She paused. "That's the whole thing, actually." Kaylin looked at her. She said, "You want to rule, don't you? Not just exist as a prince, actually rule." He wrote without hesitation, "Yes." She said, "Then we need a plan, because I don't think those people are gone. I think they went to make a phone call." She was right. In the 40 minutes between the departure of the first group and the arrival of the second, Mara learned more about Kaylin than she had learned about most people she'd known for years. That was partly the intensity of the situation, and partly the fact that when a person has been silent for a long time, not silent inside, not silent in their mind, but silent in the world, unheard in the world, they have a great deal to say once someone gives them the grammar to say it. He had learned to read lips in 3 languages. He had done this alone, from books and then from videos, because no tutor had been assigned for the purpose, and he hadn't known how to ask for one that anyone would understand. He had figured out, at around age 12, that he could follow a conversation by watching faces if he positioned himself at certain angles, and he had spent years finding reasons to stand at those angles, near windows, near doorways, at the ends of tables, so that people thought he was gazing out or hanging back when he was actually reading every word of the conversation. He knew more about the internal politics of the royal court than any advisor suspected, because no one had ever thought to lower their voice around him. He had written, in the 4 years since his father's health began to decline, and the succession question became urgent, 17 separate proposals for how his condition might be accommodated within the framework of royal governance. He had left them on desks. He had placed them in correspondence trays. He had, once, managed to get one into the hands of Lord Councillor Severin himself by slipping it beneath a door. None had received a response. He didn't know if they'd been read. He had, in the meantime, taught himself 5 different communication systems. Not just SL-adjacent signing, but also a formalized gesture language used by a deaf trading community in a province his father governed, a written shorthand used by military commanders in field situations, and a simplified version of signing he developed himself for fast communication in noise, which he had never been able to use because no one around him knew it. Mara listened to all of this, read all of this mostly, with him writing quickly and her reading and asking follow-up questions and him answering those, and felt a specific kind of fury building that she recognized from childhood, from years of being the person in the room who could translate, which meant she was also the person in the room who most clearly understood the gap between what Danny was saying and what everyone else was hearing. The gap was so obvious once you could see it. That was the worst part. It was never a mystery once you could see it. It was just a failure of attention, scaled up to the point of cruelty. She said, "These proposals you wrote. Did you keep copies?" He pulled out a phone, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't seen it, and showed her a folder of photos. He'd photographed every proposal before submitting it. She said, "Can you send those to me?" He looked at her. She said, "I'm going to need them later. I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to need them." He sent them. She texted the folder to her cousin Esperanza with the message, "Look at these. Tell me what you think. Come to the diner. Bring your laptop." Then she texted Dr. Patricia Osai, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years but whose number she'd kept because some people you keep numbers for. The way you keep a good knife even if you're not currently doing much cooking. Emergency. I know this is strange. I have a situation that I think is in your area of expertise. Can you come to Ruthie's? Then she texted Quay Masser, "You owe me from the alderman thing. I'm calling it in. Come to Ruthie's and bring your recorder." She put her phone back in her apron pocket. Kaylin was watching her. She said, "The people who just left, they work for your father." He wrote, "Technically, they work for the council that advises my father. There is a distinction." She said, "Meaning your father might not know they were here." He considered. Then, "My father knows most things, but he does not always know how the things he knows are being acted upon." She said, "So he may have sent them, or the council may have sent them using his authority. Or the council may have sent them and told him about it afterward." He wrote, "The last is most likely." She said, "Is your father, is he someone you can talk to, if the right structure was in place?" He was very still for a moment. Then he wrote, "I don't know. I have not been able to speak to him in any meaningful way in 22 years. I don't know what he thinks of me. I don't know if he has tried to find a way and failed, or if he has not tried." He paused, then wrote, "I don't know which would be worse to discover." Myra looked at this sentence for a long time. She thought about her own father, who had been better at a lot of things but not at knowing what to do with a child's grief, and who had spent years after Danny died being helpful in the wrong directions, fixing things around the apartment, cooking more food than 2 people could eat, as if the gap could be handled with logistics. She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that his incapacity was also its own kind of grief, that he'd lost the same person she had, and also didn't know what to do with that, and that the distance between them after wasn't cruelty. It was 2 people who'd both gone quiet in the same disaster and couldn't find each other in the dark. She said, "I think you might be surprised." He wrote, "I have been surprised before. It has not always been pleasant." She said, "No, but sometimes it is." He looked at her. She said, "My mother, when my brother died, I thought she would fall apart. She was always the soft one in our family, always the one I worried about, and she just didn't. She held everything together for years. She told me later that she decided she didn't have the option of falling apart because I was still there and I needed her." Mara paused. "I didn't know she'd made that decision. She never told me, she just did it. And I spent years thinking she was fine, that she was okay, that she'd processed it better than I had, when actually she'd just been carrying it in a direction I couldn't see." She stopped. She said, "I'm not saying your father is that. I'm just saying sometimes people are doing something you can't see yet." Kaylin looked at the counter. He wrote, "How did you find out?" She said, "I asked, eventually, when I was ready to hear the answer." He folded his hands on the countertop. She watched him look at them, not the private repetitive motion, not the nervous habit, but a different kind of looking, the kind you do when you're deciding something. He wrote, "I think I would like to ask. I don't know how to make it possible." She said, "I'm working on that part." They came back at noon. Not the woman in the charcoal suit this time, she was gone, which was either good or very bad. Mara couldn't decide. The new arrivals were harder-faced, fewer in number but conveying more weight somehow, the weight of people who had been given different instructions than the previous group. 3 of them. They did not ask about coffee. But Mara had not spent the last 2 hours doing nothing. She had called 3 people. The first was her cousin Esperanza, who worked in city records and knew approximately where every political line in this part of the city was drawn and who owned what. The second was a woman named Dr. Patricia Ose, who taught at the university and had written a book about multilingual diplomatic communication that Mara had read half of at the library 3 years ago before she had to return it. The third was a journalist named Quay Masser, who covered City Hall and owed her a favor from an incident involving a parking ticket and a county alderman that she'd rather not explain. None of them had arrived yet, but they were coming. She had also spent 40 minutes with Kaelin going through the specific structure of the succession dispute, who held what position, what the actual rules were, what the factions wanted and what they were afraid of, and she had realized, listening to him lay it out in careful written sentences, that he was not just politically aware. He was politically precise in the way of someone who has spent their whole life invisible in rooms where strategy was being discussed, who has observed without anyone noticing he was observing, who has thought about every angle because thinking was the only power he'd been allowed. The Dragon King's son was not unprepared. He was unfacilitated. The difference was significant. The three new arrivals crossed the diner floor, and one of them, the one in the middle, the one whose body language said he was the actual authority rather than the errand, looked at Mara and said, "We're not here to negotiate." "Nobody ever is," Mara said. "Sit down anyway, you want something to eat." "We are here to escort the prince." "Kaelin," Mara said. "His name is Kaelin, have you met him?" "Formally, I mean." The man in the middle stopped. "Because I've met him," Mara said. "We've spent the morning talking. He's extremely thorough, actually, once you have the tools to have a conversation. Did you know he's read every significant treaty his father signed in the last 30 years? He told me about one from," she looked at Kaelin, who held up 7 fingers. 7 years ago between the mountain territories and the western reaches, where a translation error almost started a war. He caught it. He flagged it. His father didn't implement the fix, but he caught it. She paused. He said he wrote a memo. The man in the middle was looking at Kaelin now. Kaelin was looking back with an expression of absolute calm, and Mara could see the work behind the calm, the careful management of it, but she could also see that it was real, that he had stopped being afraid of this specific thing, the being looked at, the being assessed, because someone had spent a morning treating his assessment of himself as credible. "I want to speak to him," the man said. "You can," Mara said. "I'll translate." It's what we're doing," Mara said. "Or I can get you a pen and paper, either works. He's fluent in writing." A long pause. The man in the middle pulled out a chair and sat down. His name was Lord Councillor Severin, and he was the head of the faction that had been arguing most loudly for Kaelin's removal from the line of succession. He was 63 years old and had served 3 kings, and considered himself a pragmatist rather than a villain, which was the most dangerous kind of person to negotiate with, Mara thought, because they always had reasons. He had a lot of reasons. The court needed a voice, literally, physically needed one. The ceremonial functions of the monarchy were built around speech, around proclamation, around the moment where the king stood before the people and said words that the people heard with their own ears. It wasn't just tradition, it was architecture. The whole structure was built around it. Mara translated all of this for Kaelin, carefully, signing what she could and writing what she couldn't. Kaelin listened. Then he wrote a response, long and very organized, and handed it to Mara. She read it. Then she looked at Lord Councillor Severin and said, "He says, the architecture is what you decide the architecture is. His great-great-grandmother Queen Valara IV governed for 6 years without appearing in person due to an illness that confined her to her chambers. She issued decrees in writing. She held council by proxy. The kingdom did not collapse. He has read her correspondence. He says it is some of the clearest governance in the historical record." Severin's expression shifted. Kaelin wrote more, Mara read. "He says, you are not describing a structural impossibility. You are describing a preference for the familiar. Those are different problems. The first cannot be solved. The second can." Severin said, "He's prepared this argument." Yes, Mara said. He's been prepared for a long time, nobody asked. The doorbell rang. Dr. Patricia Osei came in first, still putting on her coat, a leather satchel over one shoulder. Behind her, Quay Messer, who had a recorder clipped to his lapel already. Behind him, Esperanza with a laptop under her arm and the expression of someone who has driven across town for a reason she still doesn't fully understand but is choosing to trust. Mara looked at them. She looked at Lord Councillor Severin. She looked at Kaelin. She said, "I think we can solve this." What followed was 3 hours that Mara would later describe, when people asked, as the most unusual Tuesday of her life. Dr. Osei had, it turned out, consulted on multilingual diplomacy for 3 different governments, and had a detailed familiarity with protocols for communication accommodation in formal settings, including historical and contemporary models from cultures where the head of state communicated through an intermediary. She laid them out on the table with the particular energy of an academic who has spent decades knowing something nobody asked about and is now being asked. Esperanza had pulled the relevant municipal codes for ceremonial accommodation, which were not specifically about royalty, but contained language about representation and proxy that was directly applicable, and was also making very good coffee because Mara had asked her to help in the kitchen, and she'd taken that seriously. Quaim was writing everything down and had already texted his editor, which Mara had anticipated and was fine with because some problems, she had learned, got smaller when more people could see them. Kaelin sat at the counter through all of it and was consulted directly at every turn. Mara translated. Sometimes she caught herself not just translating but also filling in context. This is what he said, and this is the tone he said it in, which I know because of the particular way he held his hands when he signed it. And she realized she was doing something she hadn't done since she was a child, since Danny was alive, the particular cognitive work of being a bridge between languages, which was not just repetition but interpretation, which was not just translation but presence. She was tired. She was also more awake than she'd been in years. Lord Councillor Severin had stopped arguing around 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic surrender. It was more like watching a man who had believed a wall was load-bearing discover that it wasn't, that the structure he'd thought depended on it was perfectly fine without it, that perhaps it had never been load-bearing at all, and he just assumed it was because it had always been there. He said, finally, "The king needs to be part of this conversation." Kaelin wrote something and gave it to Mara. She read it, then she said, "He says, I know. He also says if you're reaching out to my father, please tell him that I would like to speak to him, actually speak to him. I have things to say that I haven't been able to say because no one in the palace knows sign language." She paused. "He says he's been trying to tell someone that for 4 years." The diner was quiet. Mara looked at Kaelin. He was looking at his hands, not the way he'd been looking at them when she'd first noticed him. That private repetitive motion that she now understood was a habit, a self-soothing pattern he'd developed from years of having no other outlet for the things he needed to say. He was looking at them the way you look at a tool you've just learned to use correctly, with a new understanding of what it was actually for. He looked up at her. She signed okay. He signed back, the proper ASL hand shape, the one she'd taught him an hour ago when she'd pointed out that his version was close, but the thumb placement was off. "Yes, thank you." She signed back, "You're welcome." At some point around 5 in the afternoon, with the window light going gold and long and Dr. Osei in full flow about precedent cases in 3 separate governance traditions, Mara noticed that Kaelin had stopped translating on his notepad and had started quietly, keeping his own record. He had found a legal pad from behind the counter. She'd watched him hold it up and raise a questioning eyebrow, and she'd waved him at it. And he was filling it with small, careful handwriting, dense and precise, organized into what looked like columns. She leaned over at one point to refill his coffee, and saw that he was cross-referencing Dr. Osai's precedent cases with his own proposal documents, annotating in real time, building a structure. She realized he'd done this before. Not this specific thing, but the underlying behavior sitting in a room, invisible, following a conversation no one thought he was following, making notes that no one knew he was making. He'd been doing it for 22 years in every court meeting and council session and diplomatic reception, where people had spoken around him, and past him and through him. He had, effectively, attended every significant political event of his father's reign. He had just never been allowed to participate. The legal pad, after an hour, had 40 pages. She said, in a quiet moment when Dr. Osai was on a phone call, "You're going to want to keep that." He looked down at it, then he looked up at her. She said, "When this is over and you're arguing for the formal protocol changes, that's your evidence. That's a year's worth of proposals they didn't read and a day's worth of framework they didn't know you could build." She paused. "It's proof you've been ready." He wrote slowly, "I have been ready for a long time." She said, "I know, that's what I mean." Lord Councillor Severin had, around 3 in the afternoon, made a phone call in the corner of the diner. She hadn't been able to hear most of it, but she'd heard the tone of it, which was the tone of a man reporting something unexpected to someone who hadn't expected it, and she'd seen him glance at Kalen 3 times during the call with an expression that was recalculating something it had held as fixed. After the call, he'd sat back down at the table with Dr. Osai. He'd said, in a voice that had some of its authority back but also something new in it, something that was almost careful, there would need to be a formal structure, a designated interpreter with legal standing, protocols for written correspondence and for public ceremony. Dr. Osai had said, without looking up from her notes, "I can have a draft framework in 4 days." Severin had looked at her. "You can." "I have done it before," she'd said. "For 3 governments, they are all still functioning." Severin had said, "The traditional factions will adapt," Dr. Osai had said. "People say they cannot adapt to things and then they do. It is always surprising and never actually surprising." Severin had made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Then he'd looked at Kalen and said, "The precedent you cited, Queen Valara IV, I have read her correspondence. I didn't know you had." Kalen had written a response and given it to Mara. She'd read it and said, "He says, it was in the East Archive, floor 3, unsorted boxes. He found it when he was 14. He has been waiting for a context in which to use it for 8 years. Severin had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said quietly, to no one in particular, "We have made a significant error." Mara had not said anything. Kalen had not said anything. Dr. Osai had said, "Yes, let's correct it." The Dragon King arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, in a vehicle that was quietly but unmistakably extraordinary and double-parked outside Ruthie's diner, with the confidence of a man who had never once worried about a parking ticket. He was older than she'd imagined. Not fragile, not even close, but the age was real, written in the architecture of his face, in the deliberate way he held himself, like a man who has learned to carry weight and carries it constantly. He was flanked by more suits, but he walked ahead of them, and when he came through the door of the diner, he looked across the room at his son and stopped. Kalen was still at the counter. He had not moved, which was, Mara realized, its own kind of statement that he'd stayed, that he'd held the ground, that he was here when his father arrived rather than having been retrieved. The Dragon King walked the length of the diner and sat down 2 stools from his son, which left 1 stool between them, empty, and Mara understood, without being told, to go stand at that empty stool and fill it. She did. The king looked at her. "You're the one who called all of this into motion." "I'm the waitress," she said. "He started it." The king looked at his son. Kalen looked back. The king said, "He can't," and stopped himself. Something moved across his face, something that looked like the collision between a long-held belief and a new piece of evidence that didn't support it. He said, slowly, "He has never been able to communicate, not effectively." Mara said, "He communicates extremely effectively. You didn't have anyone to translate." The king looked at her. She said, "You didn't know sign language. His people didn't know sign language. He's been speaking this whole time and nobody in the room could hear him." She paused. "I don't mean that as an accusation. I mean it as that's the problem, and it has a solution." The king was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at his son again and said, "Can you?" He stopped. He put his hands in his lap. Then he raised them, very awkwardly, and made a shape that was not quite any sign Mara recognized, but was clearly an attempt. Kalen stared at his father's hands. The king said, "I looked it up on my phone, on the way here." His voice was gruff with something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite grief. "I don't know if that's right." Mara looked at the shape. She said, "It's close. The thumb needs to come down." She reached over and very gently adjusted the king's hand. "There, that's the sign for hello." The king looked at his hands. Then he looked at his son. He signed hello. Badly, stiffly, with the particular care of someone doing something for the first time at an age when everything new feels precarious. Kalen's face did something complicated and irreversible. He signed back. Mara didn't translate that one. Some things didn't need a bridge. She stood up from the stool. She walked back to the other end of the counter and picked up the coffee pot and held it because she needed something to do with her hands. And she looked at the wall above the pass-through where there was a dented clock and a faded photo of the original Ruthie, who had opened this diner in 1967 and apparently had not wasted a single smile in her entire life based on the photographic evidence. And she breathed. Carlos appeared at the pass-through window and looked at her with wide eyes. She said, "I know." He said, "Is that the king?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What does he want?" She said, "I think he wants his son back." She paused. "I think he's been trying to figure out how for 22 years. He just finally got pointed at the right direction." Carlos looked at the two men at the other end of the counter, sitting in a diner in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, learning a new language together, one awkward gesture at a time. He said, "Do you think they want coffee?" "I think they want to be left alone for a minute," Mara said. "But make it anyway. Give it 10 minutes. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 more hours and involved Lord Councillor Severin and Dr. Osa, and a series of phone calls that Mara was not part of and did not try to be. What she was part of was the moments in between, the times when Kalen needed something translated and reached for her, and she was there. And the communication moved through her, the way water moves through a channel, not created by the channel but shaped by it, directed by it, made useful by it. She was not the story, she knew that. But she was the part the story had been missing. Around 7 in the evening, when the dinner crowd had come and gone and Ruthie's was down to its last 2 tables, and the light outside had gone amber and long, Kalen came to the end of the counter where she was tallying receipts, and he put a piece of folded paper in front of her. She unfolded it. It said, "I have been told that what happened today changes many things. I do not fully understand yet what things or how, but I wanted to tell you in your language." The next part was in careful handwriting, with a note in parentheses that said, "I had to look up the grammar, please forgive errors. I have been talking my whole life. You were the first person who listened." She folded the paper back up. She was not going to cry in the diner. She had a policy about that. She was, however, going to break it. She pressed her thumb to the paper once, twice, 3 times. "I'm here, don't go." She looked up at him. She signed, "Come back any time." He signed back, the new sign she'd taught him, the one he'd practiced 3 times to get the thumb right. "Thank you." She said, "You're going to be a good king." He looked at her. She could see that he didn't believe it yet, that it lived in him more as a question than a fact, tender and uncertain, the way new things are before they've been tested. But she could also see that he was going to keep asking the question, that he was going to keep showing up to the answer. That was enough. That was, she thought, the whole thing. The conversation between Kalen and his father lasted just under 2 hours, and most of it Mara was not party to, not because she wasn't there, but because after the first 30 minutes, the king had pulled out his own phone and opened a translation application, and the two of them had found a halting but functional rhythm between Kalen's signing and the king's clumsy attempts to read it, assisted by the app, and occasionally by Mara, when a sign was too fast or too complex for either system to catch. She stayed at the counter. She pretended to work. She watched them. The king had a quality she hadn't expected. He was a listener. Not a natural one. She could see the effort of it, the conscious slowing down, the way he had to stop himself from talking when the silence got longer than he was used to. But once he stopped, he actually listened. He leaned forward. He watched his son's hands with the concentrated attention of a man who has been given a code and is trying in real time to break it. At one point, Kalen signed something and the king reached over and put his hand briefly on his son's forearm. Just a moment, brief, a contact, and Kalen went very still, and then the king took his hand back and they both looked at the counter for a moment like they were both cataloging something. Lord Councillor Severin had left the table and come to stand near Mara. He stood there for a while without saying anything. She said, not looking at him, "How long have you known him, Kalen?" Severin said, "Since his birth." She said, "Did you know he was following the council meetings?" A pause. "I suspected, for some time. There were indications. He had a way of reacting to things, small reactions that didn't make sense unless he understood more than he was supposed to." She said, "But you didn't ask." Severin said, "No." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He said, "Because if he understood everything, it meant we had been wrong about everything, and we had been acting on that wrongness for a very long time, in ways that were difficult to reverse." He paused. "It is easier not to know. This is, I am aware, not a defense." She said, "No." He said, "What you did today was," he stopped. "I don't have the right word." She said, "You don't have to." He looked at her. "You do realize that what comes next will be complicated. There are people who invested considerably in the narrative that the prince was limited. Those people will not simply adjust. There will be opposition." She said, "There's always opposition. That's not a reason." Severin said, "No, I suppose it isn't." He was quiet. Then, "We will need someone with your particular skill set, on a formal basis. A communication liaison, an interpreter for the prince during the transition period. It would be a position of some significance." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job." "I am suggesting the possibility exists, formally structured, compensated appropriately." She said, "I have a job." He looked around the diner. She said, "Don't look at it like that." He said, "I meant no disrespect." "I know," she said. I need to think about it." She paused. "If I did it, it would need to be on real terms, not ceremonial. If I'm translating for him, I need to be in the rooms where things are actually being decided, not just the rooms where the decisions are being announced." Severin said, "That would be unconventional." She said, "A lot of things that happened today were unconventional." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I will make the argument." She said, "Okay." He went back to the table. She watched him sit down across from the king and say something in a low voice, and the king looked briefly in her direction, and then back at Severin, and she couldn't read the exchange, but she had the sense of something shifting, the way you sense the change in a room's pressure before you feel the draft. She thought about Julia Child. She thought about the culinary program that had become a someday thing. She thought about someday things, the strange way they accumulated in a life, some of them becoming never things and some of them becoming actual things eventually, and how you often couldn't tell in advance which was which. She thought maybe some doors don't open because you're standing in front of the wrong door. She thought maybe this is a different kind of kitchen. She refilled her coffee. She watched the king and his son talk in halting, effortful, newly possible language across a laminate countertop in a diner that smelled of all its previous lives, and she thought that sometimes the world changed in ways you recognized later as having been enormous, but they didn't feel enormous in the moment. They felt like a Tuesday. They felt like poured coffee and a napkin across a counter. They felt like 3 taps on a palm. "I'm here, don't go." He left with his father. The suits followed. Lord Councillor Severin paused at the door and turned back and looked at Mara for a long moment, and she thought he was going to say something, but instead he just gave a small, precise nod, the kind that meant more than it looked like, and then he was gone. Dr. Osei left her card. Quay Masser left a copy of a draft article with her name redacted, which was fine. Esperanza stayed until closing and helped Mara mop the floor, and they didn't talk about most of it because Esperanza understood, being a woman who dealt in records and evidence, that some things needed to be processed before they could be discussed. Mara turned off the lights at 9:15. She walked the 4 blocks home. The night was cool, and the street was quiet, and overhead the first stars were doing their patient work of being older than everything she knew and not caring about any of it. She thought about Danny. She thought, "I was your voice for a long time, and I was glad to be, and then I wasn't able to be anymore, and I have been trying to work out how to be a person who knows that ever since." She thought maybe this is how. Not replacement, never replacement. Something else, a continuation, a use of the things she'd learned from him, the grammar he'd given her, turned outward into the world. The language he'd taught her put to work. She got home. Grid the cat was on the counter, which he wasn't supposed to be, and he looked at her with the absolute ethical confidence of a creature who has never doubted a decision in his life. She picked him up. She thought about the king's clumsy hands, the careful angle of a thumb, a son's face in the moment of receiving something he'd been waiting for without knowing if it would ever come. She thought some things have a solution and no one's tried it yet. She thought that's not a reason to stop. She put on the kettle. She took Julia Child off the shelf. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, enormous and indifferent and full. Every window a world. Every world a person trying to be heard by someone who knows how to listen. She opened the book. She started reading.